Welcome to the first Leader Lunch Break of February. We're thrilled to have you all join us. And we're thrilled to welcome Stephen Love. Stephen has a long commitment to issues relating to protecting the environment and promoting sustainability. From his leadership in organizing beach cleanup efforts at Euclid Beach and advocacy efforts around cleaning the beach, to his current role as the Cleveland Foundation's Environmental Program Officer, he lives his passion. He joined the Cleveland Foundation almost 9 years ago as part of community responsive grant making and brought his passion for the environment to fruition in 2018 when he became that environmental program officer. In this role, he is responsible for the development and execution of the Foundation's environmental grant-making strategy. Prior, he worked at Cuyahoga Land Bank, where he explored vacant property reuse. Consistent with his passion, he previously served on boards of the Cleveland Lakefront Conservancy and the Northeast Shores Development Corporation. He's been recognized by Cranes in 2017 as 20 in their 20s. We at the Cleveland Leadership Center are proud to call him a Cleveland Bridge Builder alum, one of the many who are creating positive change in Northeast Ohio. Of particular note for our conversation today, Stephen was part of the Cleveland delegation that went to the United Nations Climate Conference in Egypt, and we look forward to hearing about what change is happening to create a more sustainable future in Northeast Ohio. Stephen?
Well, thank you, Marianne. Can you hear me? Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Rachel, Marianne, the CLC team, for the opportunity to share some reflections on COP27 this afternoon. And for all of you tuning in, I know I have some tough acts to follow on the lunchtime circuit here, but hope to be at least half as engaging as the music was this afternoon. I'm going to pull up my slide, make sure. All right, perfect. Can everyone see that as well?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So as Marianne mentioned, we had a Cleveland delegation to COP27. What is COP27? Well, the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, say that fast, represents really the single largest international gathering of world leaders on climate. The summit occurs annually to discuss international climate policy efforts to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And this past November, over 35,000 people from 197 countries met in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, for the 27th Conference of Parties, or COP27 for short. And the Cleveland Foundation, in partnership with the Gun Foundation here in Cleveland, was proud to support and join a delegation of our leaders from the region to attend this summit for the first time. But you're probably wondering, why is it important for a community foundation to be at a global climate summit? Or why is it important for our leadership to be there? Well, we went because we understand the urgency of the climate crisis, and we know we don't have time to waste, and that also the climate impacts that we're feeling globally are also being felt right here at home. And in addition to the diplomatic negotiations that are the centerpiece of any COP convening, we know that this really also presents an unparalleled opportunity for leaders from across the globe to come together to exchange ideas, best practices, and build partnerships to accelerate climate action. And I think it also creates opportunities for Cleveland to be on a global stage. So for our leadership, this was a strategic opportunity and moment in time to begin to pull together the public, private, nonprofit sectors to see how regions from across the world are expanding energy around clean energy investment and expanding action on climate as a driver for economic and workforce development. We also know that Ohio matters to the global climate equation. If you didn't know this, the state of Ohio, we're the third highest emitter of greenhouse gases. That number, unfortunately, continues to go up and not down. We're also the fifth and sixth for worst air quality in the country. So our impacts here matter greatly to the climate equation globally. If we were our own country, Ohio would be 26th highest CO2 emitter in the globe. We also know that these climate impacts disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color first and worse, while exacerbating the health disparities and environmental impacts that have already burdened these communities. And we know that Cleveland's history of structural racism, environmental disparities, and current standing as the second poorest major city in the country continues to make our communities and our community members more vulnerable. But while climate is a global issue, climate action must hit the ground at the local level. And we believe that the transition away from fossil fuels truly does present the biggest economic development opportunity of our time. And for manufacturing regions like Greater Cleveland, an opportunity to really center this region at the front of the supply chain for what's going to be our clean economy. And as a community foundation, we truly do think and believe that philanthropy can and must really play a convening role to bring partners together and catalyze action here on the ground, because the health of our climate and the health of our environment really undergirds the health of our community and intersects all of our long-term strategy and work as a foundation. So who did we bring with us to COP27? So along with myself, we have in the picture here Chris Ronayne, who's our county executive. Mind you, only 2 days after winning the election, boarding a plane to Egypt was probably not the easiest thing, but Chris was very passionate about climate and wanting to take a leadership role. Baiju Shah is also pictured here as the head of our chamber, the Greater Cleveland Partnership. Michael Jeans is the president and CEO of Growth Opportunity Partners and also leads up the first Green Bank, the Go Green Fund here in Cuyahoga County. Ron Richard is the president and CEO of the Cleveland Foundation. Mayor Justin Bibb, unfortunately, was not able to join us in person, but did in fact join us for a couple of opportunities and presentations virtually. My counterpart at the George Gunn Foundation, John Mitterhoser, who's their Director of Climate and Environment, Deepa Vedavyas, who's my counterpart at the Cleveland Foundation and our Program Manager for Neighborhoods and Environment, and finally, Alyssa Johnson, who is our Gunn Foundation Fellow, very helpful on the logistics front in joining us. Mind you, last year only one delegate was at a COP convening, and that was John Mitterhoser at COP 26 in Glasgow. But this year, we were the only U.S. metro with a delegation of 8, including our county executive, head of our chamber, and head of our foundation. So we hope to change that trajectory and put Cleveland on a global leadership stage. So what were some of the high-level takeaways? I think, first off, this COP was intentionally set in Africa, in Egypt, a place where people are feeling the impacts of climate first and worst, and ultimately have done the least to cause it. And this year's COP was really framed around implementation. Implementation to develop a loss and damage fund to compensate and support adaptation projects in developing countries that are facing the most severe impacts of climate. The Pakistan pavilion and the comments from the Pakistani delegation, just pictured here, were particularly moving. Recounting the floods last year that killed thousands across the country and displaced millions. And while there was a breakthrough in the development of a loss and damage fund for climate impacts, it's only the first step, and success of that mechanism is really only going to depend on how quickly this fund gets off the ground and how the developed countries ultimately support it. It was also the COP to focus on implementing the goals of the Paris Climate Accord, which were strengthened at Glasgow to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And within the Paris Accord, each country does set a nationally determined contribution or NDC towards greenhouse gas reductions. For example, the US, when we rejoined Paris in 2021, set an ambitious target of reducing greenhouse gases 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. So only a few short years away. And while climate represents, one of the few, I think, if only, issues where the global community comes together, it's clear that government and diplomatic negotiations thus far have largely failed or just haven't moved fast enough, right, to address climate change and the far-reaching impacts. But what was again made clear to us at COP was, this was an opportunity to participate in thousands of side events and programs that civil society is leading, that whether we're thinking about states, regions, cities, NGOs, the business community, and what was made really clear is they're not waiting. They're not waiting, they're collaborating, they're implementing, they're getting well ahead in many cases of national governments in setting ambitious targets and figuring out how to rapidly decarbonize this decade, and hopefully in alignment with their country's nationally determined contribution, but they're not going to wait around. And what do I mean by that, and what did we see? We had an opportunity, for example, to listen in on a fascinating discussion around the Transportation Electrification Partnership, which is an effort led by Los Angeles County to get to 80% of EV penetration in Los Angeles County by 2028, which is the California or the Los Angeles Olympics, and also to get their transit authority to be 100% EV by 2028. And it's also becoming a statewide effort beyond just Los Angeles County. And so we saw the power of sort of regional collaboration to drive strategy around EVs. We saw the importance of nature-based solutions in many different contexts, but certainly one really great opportunity coordinated by my colleague, Deepa Vedavyas, with her international networks, was to convene our delegation with the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, who are working on thinking about nature-based solutions in the context of curbing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly protecting and conserving our rainforests. But how can we begin to take some of those same solution sets and actions back here in Cleveland when we think about urban forestry, green infrastructure, and other nature-based solutions? We also heard about the water and climate nexus really being front and center at this year's COP. And I think for our delegation, there's a really strong desire to center our region, which is, on the doorstep of the Great Lakes and 20% of our Earth's fresh surface water, as a leader in both protecting our fresh water, but ultimately thinking about how we can be an innovative leader when it comes to a freshwater future, knowing that water and climate are so inextricably linked together with each other, and going to increasingly be seeing that nexus in the years to come. We also had an opportunity to learn, I think, a great deal from the Business Pavilion, which I mentioned earlier. I think just demonstrates that the business community is not waiting. The markets are moving in this direction. And there were some really fascinating conversations around, how are we really focusing on the hard to decarbonize industries like steel and concrete and other manufacturing, that, if we can position the solutions here in this region towards some of those really challenging sectors, how do we then position our region as the center of that clean economy innovation? There was also, I think, a strong youth and climate advocacy and climate justice presence. I will say, the Egyptian government, unlike Glasgow, there was not the ability for significant civil society protests, which is often a major feature of the COP convenings. And so those voices were heard in different ways. Here was I think a really moving collage from youth across the globe that were sending letters to delegates at the COP. And I think it was just a really incredible networking opportunity for our local leadership, and hopefully building, again, that global exchange of that global network. For example, there was an opportunity to meet with the mayor of Dhaka in Bangladesh, a country that's on the front lines of the climate crisis. But the mayor, in the face of that, is taking a significant leadership role, is actually vice chair of the C40 climate mayors, and taking many adaptation projects forward in Bangladesh, despite the incredible challenges that country is facing. And so after taking all of this in, the experience culminated with a great discussion from our leadership delegation, presenting on the Climate Registry Pavilion stage on our last day about why we attended and what we hope to bring back home and to align assets and leadership to take action. And I think if there's an opportunity, Marianne or Rachel, as a follow-on to this presentation, or if there's a recording shared, it would be great if we could send the recording from this presentation that the Climate Registry facilitated as well. So where do we go from here? Well, it's clear that collective action at the local level is going to be needed, especially if we want to ensure that that action is equitable and that everyone is going to benefit from the transition to a clean economy. But the playbook hasn't been written, and I think it's clear that the collaboration across the globe is writing it, but no one's entirely figured it out yet. But we think that Cleveland has a role to play, and the region has a role to play in shaping that transition and showing the world what an equitable transition can look like. But again, it's not going to happen if we don't have the coordination. I think there's an opportunity to bring that cross-sector collaboration together now as we come back home and think about how do we begin to develop some globally aligned goals that are embedded into our local solutions and actions. And now's the moment, right? We have new leadership across many sectors, public and private and nonprofit. And we have once in a generation dollars through the federal government to begin to seize this opportunity and align those federal dollars, whether that's through the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill, to these plans and to these action goals, and begin to capitalize on this opportunity. And we need to build on our assets and partnerships and history of these cross-sector partnerships and drive them towards action on climate. And so from here, to borrow a phrase from the Cavs, the Greater Cleveland Partnership and apparently the COP Pavilion, at Business Pavilion, we are all in. We're all in on developing and refining a framework for collective action, identifying projects in the short term that we can implement, and ultimately over the long term, really putting forward targets and benchmarks and communicating a common message along the way. And I think hopefully coming back to COP, whether that's COP 28 or COP 29, and being prepared to share a framework for action with the rest of the world, and showing the world that Cleveland is taking leadership in this space. So with that, thank you for listening this afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to the Q&A. And I'll stop sharing.
Yep. Stephen, thank you so much. So let's start with just as you heard the various topics throughout the conference and coming back to Cleveland, as you assess our region, what should Cleveland's priorities be as we look to address climate change in our region?
That's a great question. I mean, again, I think as we think about the opportunity here, this is about how do we successfully carry out an economic transition? This addressing climate is ultimately the most significant economic transition of our time, right? We're saying we need to decarbonize our economy. And so I think for a region like Cleveland that not only has a history of leaving people behind, but has a lot of manufacturing assets and other assets that are going to be critical to that transition, we need to figure out how to align those opportunities. And so I think that's one part of this equation, then the equitable transition. And then I think the other is, how do we ensure that when we're thinking about mitigating the impacts of climate change, again, whether that's, heavier rainfall, hotter temperatures, more extreme weather events, how are we ensuring that, those mitigation efforts are done in a way that ultimately are with community and are shaped, in a way that ultimately benefit the communities that are going to be most feeling those impacts first. So I think for us, it's about the economic transition, ensuring that that's equitable and being intentional about how we drive investments there, but also then thinking about the climate mitigation impacts.
So you mentioned collaboration and bringing entities together is so important. Who's going to take the lead, and how does the lead get the word out that initiatives are happening? Kind of ultimately, who's responsible for driving this in Northeast Ohio?
Well, I mean, in short, I think we all are, but I think at the end of the day, if we need to build this cross-sector coalition, but I think the public sector, the county and the city leadership, I think stand to ultimately support and lead this effort. I think the foundations, historically have played, a convening role and a support role to catalyze those partners together. But again, philanthropy alone isn't going to solve our problems or lead on these issues. We might sound like we have the financial bandwidth to do that, but these are very significant challenges with very significant price tags. And so the role of philanthropy goes well beyond grant making. It's really about bringing partners together, convening partners and coalescing. And if we can support the development of that action agenda with the public sector, then taking the leadership and the business community, of course, supporting that as well. I think that's the successful equation. And I think we've seen that successful equation play out in other arenas, right? If we think about the focus on education reform, if we think about the coalition efforts that led to the lead abatement in Cleveland, we have plenty of examples of cross-sector partnerships, but it's going to take sustained coordination.
In the few weeks that you all have been back, what are some of those initial steps that you have taken to start to implement some of the learnings that you took away from the conference?
Well, I think part of it is what we're doing today, right? It's communicating out, and we've had a few opportunities to share out to the rest of the community some of our takeaways from COP27, and certainly some of the framing that I think is beginning to take shape. The leadership delegation that went to COP, has certainly agreed to continue to come together. They came together a few weeks ago with, I think, the intent of beginning to take what has felt sort of at a high level a frame and begin to apply that frame to really what are some short-term project opportunities where we can have collective impact, while beginning to frame out what is a long-term set of goals, and how do we begin to put some benchmarks and accountability around that. And if 2030 is ultimately our target to really take substantive action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then what can we as a collective region begin to put in place to account for that?
In what ways did the Great Lakes, in particular Lake Erie, make its way into conversations, and what are some of the top concerns?
Yeah, so I think in a number of the conversations, at least if you can tune into the climate registry talk that was recorded, I think you'll hear from our regional leaders that there is a true desire to position this region as a freshwater center, right? As a freshwater capital, where we are both leading on the innovation side, thinking about how to take what has been a set of problems, whether we're talking about algal blooms, whether we're talking about invasive species, whether we're talking about plastics pollution, take some of those challenges and actually turn them into innovation opportunities for this region. And then ultimately, these are not unique issues to the Great Lakes or to Cleveland, but ultimately they're freshwater issues globally. And I think the freshwater issues globally are becoming just more and more acute, right? And so how do we, in the face of that issue, begin to position Cleveland as the center of knowledge and innovation and development around these issues? I think the reality, and I think this is a challenging discussion to have, but is, as the Great Lakes are in a potentially more resilient part of the country from climate impact standpoint, will we begin to see pressure, whether that's migration or whether that's company or investment from other parts of the country coming to this region? And I think that's a question we don't fully know. Given the climate impact modeling, we don't exactly know where this region will fare. But we do think that it's going to be a more resilient region, at least in the near term, when it comes to maintaining that fresh water. And so how do we begin to think about even the impacts long term this century, of migration? And in the short term, how do we begin to position the region as a place to do business, right? As a resilient region to do business. But we have to get the resilient piece first, right? We can't continue to tout that we're a good place to do business and that we're going to be resilient in the face of climate impacts if we're the third highest emitter of greenhouse gas, right? So we gotta focus our attention on reducing emissions first and foremost, and then we can have the conversation around the economic development of business attraction.
So, Stephen, as the Cleveland Foundation looks to head to its new headquarters, how might the foundation have been incorporating green technology strategy into that development as well as the surrounding neighborhood?
Yeah, that's a great question. As part of our ethos with the relocation to Midtown, we really wanted to ensure that this space, articulates the core values of the Cleveland Foundation. And when we think about one of those core values is, how does this building, relate to its environment and to the built environment and to the surrounding community? And so we, from the beginning, integrated that process into the design. And so we are a LEED Silver building, and we have a number of components across the design of the building, whether that's we will have the largest solar canopy in our carport facility, and that will be generating over about, on a good day, close to about 70% of the building's energy needs. We'll have a green infrastructure pavers and green infrastructure bioswales surrounding the property. The property was built to highest energy efficiency standards. And we'll also have a building automation system that's going to have interactive displays so that the community, because the first floor is going to be really oriented to community space, those display boards will be able to help kind of communicate some of the sustainable design features of the building and how they plug into a broader sort of narrative around Cleveland's efforts towards sustainability and sustainable design.
Stephen, you've mentioned a few times about Ohio's place in driving emissions. So can you talk about why is that so, and how do we land on that list so high?
Well, yeah, well, part of the issue is, I mean, we're a heavy manufacturing state. We're also a populous state. We're the 7th most populous state in the country. So there's high residential emissions, high manufacturing emissions, and then of course high transportation emissions. We have a lot of single occupant vehicles and other truck emissions, diesel emissions. But the reality is our number is going up because other states in the region and other states in the country are doing better. From a policy standpoint, they're adopting policies that are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so one of the challenges for this region is to, in the face of bad policy or challenging policy down in Columbus, how do we continue to move efforts forward as a region to continue to keep Ohio on track? And so just a little plug-in for an effort that the two foundations, Cleveland and Gunn Foundations, are supporting. It's called Power a Clean Future Ohio. And that is an effort to bring together a coalition of communities across the state to commit to up to 30% emissions reductions by 2030. In effect, getting communities to stay on that path towards 1.5 degrees. And to date, we have over 50 communities in Ohio and several counties across the state who've committed, and ultimately have committed even more ambitious targets than that. And so now we're really trying to align those ambitious commitments with funding opportunities from the federal level and other coordinated technical supports so that they can actually implement those goals.
So for our final question today, what can individuals, small businesses do that can help to have an impact as we look to address these challenges in our region?
Yeah, well, I think at an individual level, at a small business level, I think it's making sure your voice is heard, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, we need to speak up so that our policymakers, our lawmakers hear us, right? That this is about not only addressing climate change, but this is about not missing out on the biggest economic development opportunity of our time, right? And so how do we begin to articulate that message? I think we need to collectively do it, but we can do it on a daily basis. I think there's also certainly actions, that we can take, within our day-to-day lives. But we know that ultimately the systems level change that's going to be needed is going to be at the policymaker level. I think it's also an opportunity to work together at the local level, right? The more we can collaborate and plug into efforts, whether that's NOACA's climate action planning effort or the county's climate planning effort, the city's planning effort that's about to kick back off. I think there's a lot of opportunities and ways to get involved and to be a part of this big, broadening community. The Greater Cleveland Partnership had their first sustainability summit. It was awesome convening of over 350 people last week. I think the more that folks can get plugged into the business community's momentum around these issues, I think that's another voice that hopefully resonates more in Ohio and certainly can and has to be, I think, frankly, a part of this equation. So So getting plugged in, making your voice heard, and taking action on the ground.
Stephen, well, thank you so much for your time and insights today. What a fantastic opportunity for Cleveland to have this experience to be able to bring back to our community. And for those on the call, I will be sure to send along the recording so that you all can see the presentation from the conference as well.
Well,
Thanks so much. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just gonna say, well, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for tuning in this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Well, you certainly enlightened a lot of us, and the statistics you showed at the beginning in terms of where Ohio ranks are just very frightening. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do better. So thank you for inspiring us in that way.